12. Revelstone. The pressure against his left cheek began slowly to wear his skin raw, and the pain nagged him up off the bottom of his slumber. Turbulence rushed under his head as if he were pillowed on shoals. He labored his way out of sleep. Then his cheek was jolted twice in rapid succession, and his resting place heaved. Pushing himself up, he smacked his head on a thwart of the boat. Pain throbbed in his skull. He gripped the thwart, swung himself away from the rib which had been rubbing his cheek, and sat up to look over the gunwales. He found that the situation of the boat had changed radically. No shade or line or resonance of Andalusian richness remained in the surrounding terrain. On the northeast, the river was edged by a high, bluff rock wall, and to the west spread a gray and barren plain, a crippled wilderness like a vast battleground, where more than men had been slain, where the fire that scorched and the blood that drenched had blighted the ground's ability to revitalize itself, bloom again. An uneven, despoiled lowland marked only by the scrub trees clinging to life along the river which poured into the Soul Seas a few 100 yards ahead of the boat. The eastering wind carried an old burnt odor, and behind it lay the fetid memory of a crime. Already the river joining ahead troubled the Soul Seas, knotted its current, stained its clarity with flinty mud, and Covenant had to grip the gunwales to keep his balance as the pitching of the boat increased. Foamfollower held the boat in the center of the river, away from the turmoil against the northeast rock wall. Covenant glanced back at the giant. He was standing in the stern, feet widely braced, tiller clamped under his right arm. At Covenant's glance, he called over the mounting clash of the rivers. Trothgard lies ahead. Here we turn north, the White River. The gray comes from the west. His voice had a strident edge to it, as if he had been singing as strongly as he could all night. But after a moment he sang out a fragment of a different song. For we will not rest, not turn aside, lost faith, or fail, until the gray flows blue, and rill and merrill are as new and clean as ancient Lurelin. The heaving of the river mounted steadily. Covenant stood in the bottom of the boat, bracing himself against one of the thwarts, gripping the gunwale, and watched and forced commingling of the clean and tainted waters. Then Foamfollower shouted, 100 leagues to the western mountains, Guard's Gap and the high spring of the Laurelin, and 150 southwest to the last hills and garroting deep. We are 70 from Lord's Keep. Abruptly, the river's moiling growl sprang louder, smothered the giant's voice. An unexpected lash of the current caught the boat and tore its prow to the right, bringing it broadside to the stream. Spray slapped Covenant as the boat heeled over. Instinctively, he threw his weight onto the left gunwale. The next instant, he heard a snatch of Foamfollower's plain song and felt power thrumming deeply along the keel. Slowly, the boat righted itself, swung into the current again. But the near disaster had carried them dangerously close to the northeast wall. The boat trembled with energy as Foamfollower worked it gradually back into the steadier water flowing below the main force of the gray's current. Then the sensation of power faded from the keel. "Your pardon," the giant shouted. "I am losing my seamanship." His voice was raw with strain. Covenant's knuckles were white from clenching the gunwales. As he bounced with the pitch of the boat, he remembered, there is only one good answer to death. One good answer, he thought. This isn't it. Perhaps it would be better if the boat capsized, better if he drowned, better if he did not carry Lord Fowl's message half-handed and beringed to Revelstone. He was not a hero. He could not satisfy such expectations. "Now the crossing," Foamfollower called. "We must pass the Grey to go on north. There is no great danger, except that I am weary, and the rivers are high." This time Covenant turned and looked closely at the giant. He saw now that Saltheart Foamfollower was suffering. His cheeks were sunken, hollowed as if something had gouged the geniality out of his face, and his cavernous eyes burnt with taut, febrile volition. Weary, Covenant thought, more like exhausted. He lurched awkwardly from thwart to thwart until he reached the giant. His eyes were no higher than Foamfollower's waist. He tipped his head back to shout, "I'll steer, you rest." The smile flickered on the giant's lips. "I thank you, but no, you are not ready. I am strong enough, but please lift the diamond draft to me." Covenant opened the food sack and put his hands on the leather jug. Its weight and suppleness made it unwieldy for him, and the tossing of the boat unbalanced him. He smiled. He simply could not lift the jug, but after a moment he got his arms under it. With a groan of exertion, he heaved it upward. Foamfollower caught the neck of the jug neatly in his left hand. "Thank you, my friend," he said with a ragged grin. Raising the jug to his mouth, he disregarded the perils of the current for a moment to drink deeply. Then he put down the jug and swung the boat toward the mouth of the Grey River. Another surge of power throbbed through the craft. As it hit the main force of the Grey, Foamfollower turned downstream and angled across the flow. Energy quivered in the floorboards. In a smooth maneuver, Foamfollower reached the north side of the current, pivoted upstream with the backwash along the wall, and let it sling him into the untroubled white. Once he had rounded the northward curve, the roar of the joining began to drop swiftly behind the boat. A moment later, the throb of power faded again. Sighing heavily, Foamfollower wiped the sweat from his face. His shoulders sagged and his head bowed. With labored slowness he lowered the tiller and at last dropped into the stern of the boat. "Ah, my friend," he groaned, "even giants are not made to do such things." Covenant moved to the center of the boat and took a seat in the bottom, leaning against one of the sides. From that position he could not see over the gunwales, but he was not at present curious about the terrain. He had other concerns. One of them was Foamfollower's condition. He did not know how the giant had become so exhausted. He tried to approach the question indirectly by saying, "That was neatly done. How did you do it? You didn't tell me what powers this thing." And he frowned at the tactless sound of his voice. "Ask for some other story," Foamfollower sighed wearily. "That one is nearly as long as the history of the land. I have no heart to teach you the meaning of life here." "You don't know any short stories," responded Covenant. At this, the giant managed a wan smile. "Ah, that is true enough. Well, I will make it brief for you. But then you must promise to tell a story for me, something rare that I will never guess for myself. I will need that, my friend." Covenant agreed with a nod, and Foamfollower said, "Well, eat, and I will talk." Vaguely surprised at how hungry he was, Covenant tackled the contents of Foamfollower's sack. He munched meat and cheese rapidly, satisfied his thirst with tangerines, and while he ate, the giant began in a voice flat with fatigue. "The time of Damelon, giant friend, came to an end in the land before my people had finished the making of Coorcree, their home in Sea Reach. They carved Lord's Keep, as men call it, out of the mountain's heart before they labored on their own Lord-given land, and Lorik was High Lord when Coorcree was done. Then my forebears turned their attention outward, to the sun-birthed sea and to the friendship of the land. Now both Lilianril and Radmeril desired to study the lore of the giants, and the time of High Lord Lorik Vilesilencer was one of great growth for the Lilianril. To help in this growth, it was necessary for the giants to make many sojourns to Lord's Keep. He broke into a quiet chant, singing for a while as if in invocation of the old grandeur of giantish reverence to mighty Revelstone. This was well, for it kept Revelstone bright in their eyes. But the giants are not great lovers of walking, no more so then than now. So my forebears bethought them of the rivers which flow from the western mountains to the sea, and decided to build boats. Well, boats cannot come here from the sea, as you may know. Landsdrop, on which stands Graven Threndor, blocks the way, and no one, giant or otherwise, would willingly sail the Defile's course from Life-Swallower, the great swamp. So the giants built docks on the Soul Seas, upriver from Graven Threndor and the narrows now called Treacher's Gorge. There they kept such boats as this, there and at Lord's Keep at the foot of the Furrow Falls, so that at least 200 leagues of the journey might be on the water which we love. In this journeying, Lord and the Lilianril desired to be of aid to the giants. Out of their power they crafted Gildan load, a strong wood which they named Lor Liaril, and from this wood they made rudders and keels for our river boats. And it was the promise of the old lords that when their omens for a hope for us came to pass, then Gildan load would help us. Ah, enough, Foamfollower sighed abruptly. In short, it is I who impel this craft. He lifted his hand from the tiller, and immediately the boat began to lose headway. Or rather, it is I who call out the power of the Gildan load. There is life and power in the earth, in stone and wood and water and earth, but life in them is somewhat hidden, somewhat slumberous. Both knowledge and strength are needed, yes, and potent vital songs to awaken them. He grasped the tiller again, and the boat moved forward once more. So I am weary, he breathed. I have not rested since that night before we met. The tone reminded Covenant of Trell's fatigue after the Gravelingus had healed the broken pot. For 2 days and 2 nights I have not allowed the Gildan load to stop or slow, though my bones are weak with the expense. To the surprise in Covenant's face, he added, Yes, my friend, you slept for 2 nights and a day, from the west of Andalane across the center plains to the marge of Trothgard, more than 100 leagues. After a pause, he concluded, Diamond Draught does such things to humans. But you had need of rest. For a moment, Covenant sat silent, staring at the floorboards as if he were looking for a place to hit them. His mouth twisted sourly when he raised his head and said, So now I'm rested. Can I help? Foamfollower did not reply immediately. Behind the buttress of his forehead he seemed to weigh his various uncertainties before he muttered, Stone and sea, of course you can, and yet the very fact of asking shows that you cannot. Some unwillingness or ignorance prevents. Covenant understood. He could hear dark wings, see slaughtered wraiths. Wild magic, he groaned. Heroism. This is unsufferable. With a jerk of his head, he knocked transitions aside and asked roughly, Do you want my ring? Want? Foamfollower croaked, looking as if he felt he should laugh but did not have the heart for it. Want? His voice quavered painfully as if he were confessing to some kind of aberration. Do not use such a word, my friend. Wanting is natural and may succeed or fail without wrong. Say covet rather. To covet is to desire something which should not be given. Yes, I covet your unearth, wild magic, peace-ending white gold. There is magic graven in every rock, contained for white gold to unleash your control. I admit the desire, but do not tempt me. power has a way of revenging itself upon its usurpers. I would not accept this ring if you offered it to me." "But you do know how to use it?" Covenant inquired dully, half dazed by his inchoate fear of the answer. This time Foamfollower did laugh. His humor was emaciated, a mere wisp of its former self, but it was clean and gay. "Ah, bravely said, my friend. So covetousness collapses of its own folly. No, I do not know. If the wild magic may not be called up by the simple decision of use, then I do not understand it at all. Giants do not have such lore. We have always acted for ourselves, though we gladly use such tools as Gildan load. Well, I am rewarded for unworthy thoughts. Your pardon, Thomas Covenant." Covenant nodded mutely as if he had been given an unexpected reprieve. He did not want to know how wild magic worked. He did not want to believe in it in any way. Simply carrying it around was dangerous. He covered it with his right hand and gazed dumbly, helplessly at the giant. After a moment, Foamfollower's fatigue quenched his humor. His eyes dimmed and his respiration sighed wearily between his slack lips. He sagged on the tiller as if laughing had cost him vital energy. "Now, my friend," he breathed, "my courage is nearly spent. I need your story." "Story?" Covenant thought. "I don't have any stories. I burned them." He had burned them, both his new novel and his bestseller. They had been so complacent, so abjectly blind to the perils of leprosy, which lurked secretive and unpredictable behind every physical or moral existence, and so unaware of their own sightlessness. They were carrion, like himself, fit only for flames. What story could he tell now? But he had to keep moving, act, survive. Surely he had known that before he had become the victim of dreams. Surely he had known that before he had become the victim of dreams. Had he not learned it at the leprosarium, in putrefaction and vomit? Yes, survive. And yet this dream expected power of him, expected him to put an end to slaughter. Images flashed through him like splinters of vertigo, mirror shards. Joan, police car, Drool's level eyes. He reeled as if he were falling. To conceal his sudden distress, he moved away from Foamfollower, went to sit in the prow facing north. "A story," he said thickly. In fact, he did know one story in all its grim and motley disguises. He sorted quickly, vividly, until he found one which suited the other things he needed to articulate. "I'll tell you a story. A true story." He gripped the gunwales, fought down dizziness. "It's a story about culture shock. Do you know what culture shock is?" Foamfollower did not reply. "Never mind. I'll tell you about it. Culture shock is what happens when you take a man out of his own world and put him down in a place where the assumptions, the standards of being a person are so different that he can't possibly understand them. He isn't built that way. If he's facile, he can pretend to be someone else until he gets back to his own world, or he can just collapse and let himself be rebuilt. However, there's no other way. I'll give you an example. While I was at the leprosarium, the doctors talked about a man, a leper, like me, outcast. He was a classic case. He came from another country, where leprosy is a lot more common. He must have picked up the bacillus there as a child, and years later, when he had a wife and 3 kids of his own and was living in another country, he suddenly lost the nerves in his toes and started to go blind. Well, if he had stayed in his own country, he would have been... The disease is common. It would have been recognized early. As soon as it was recognized, he and his wife and his kids and everything he owned and his house and his animals and his close relatives, they would have all been declared unclean. His property and house and animals would have been burned to the ground, and he and his wife and his kids and his close relatives would have been sent away to live in the most abject poverty in a village with other people who had the same disease. He would have spent the rest of his life there, without treatment, without hope, while hideous deformity gnawed his arms and legs and face, until he and his wife and his kids and his close relatives all died of gangrene. Do you think that's cruel? Let me tell you what did happen to the man. As soon as he recognized his disease, he went to his doctor. His doctor sent him to the leprosarium, alone, without his family, where the spread of the disease was arrested. He was treated, given medicine and training, rehabilitated. Then he was sent home to live a normal life with his wife and kids. How nice. There was only one problem. He couldn't handle it. To start with, his neighbors gave him a hard time. Oh, at first they didn't know he was sick. They weren't familiar with leprosy, didn't recognize it. But the local newspaper printed a story on him so that everyone in town knew he was the leper. They shunned him, hated him because they didn't know what to do about him. Then he began to have trouble keeping up his self-treatments. His home country didn't have medicine and lepers therapy. In his bones he believed that such things were magic, that once his disease was arrested he was cured, pardoned, given a stay of something worse than execution. But lo and behold, when he stops taking care of himself, the numbness starts to spread again. Then comes the clincher. Suddenly he finds that behind his back, while he wasn't even looking, much less alert, he has been cut off from his family. They don't share his trouble, far from it. They want to get rid of him, go back to living the way they were before. So they pack him off to the leprosarium again. But after getting on the plane, they didn't have planes in his home country either. He goes to the bathroom as if he had been disinherited without anyone ever telling him why, and slits his wrists. He gaped wide-eyed at his own narration. He would have been willing, eager to weep for the man if he had been able to do so without sacrificing his own defenses. But he could not weep. Instead, he swallowed thickly and let his momentum carry him on again. And I'll tell you something else about culture shock. Every world has its own ways of committing suicide, and it is a lot easier to kill yourself using methods that you're not accustomed to. I could never slit my wrists. I've read too much about it. Talked about it too much. It's too vivid. I would throw up. But I could go to that man's world and sip belladonna tea without nausea, because I don't know enough about it. There's something vague about it, something obscure, something not quite fatal. So that poor man in the bathroom sat there for over an hour, just letting his lifeblood run into the sink. He didn't try to get up until all of a sudden, finally, he realized that he was going to die just as dead as if he had sipped belladonna tea. Then he tried to open the door, but he was too weak, and he didn't know how to push the button to get help. They eventually found him in this grotesque position on the floor with his fingers broken, as if he had tried to crawl under the door. He could not go on. Grief choked him into silence, and he sat still for a time, while water lamented dimly past the prow. He felt sick, desperate for survival. He could not submit to these seductions. Then Foamfollower's voice reached him. Softly, the giant said, "Is this why you abandoned the telling of stories?" Covenant sprang up, whirled in instant rage. "This land of yours is trying to kill me," he spat fiercely. You're pressuring me into suicide. White gold? Barrack? Wraiths? You're doing things to me that I can't handle. I'm not that kind of person. I don't live in that kind of world. All these seductions. Hell and blood. I'm a leper. Don't you understand that? For a long moment, Foamfollower met Covenant's hot gaze, and the sympathy of the giant's eyes stopped his outburst. He stood glaring with his fingers clawed, while Foamfollower regarded him sadly, wearily. He could see that the giant did not understand. Leprosy was a word that seemed to have no meaning in the land. "Come on," he said with an ache. "Laugh about it. Joy is in the ears that hear." But then Foamfollower showed that he did understand something. He reached into his jerkin and drew out a leather packet, which he unfolded to produce a large sheet of supple hide. "Here," he said, "you will see much of this before you are done with the land. It is Klingor. The giants brought it to the land long ages ago, but I will spare us both the effort of telling." He tore a small square from the corner of the sheet and handed the piece to Covenant. It was sticky on both sides, but transferred easily from hand to hand and left no residue of glue behind. "Trust it. Place your ring upon that piece and hide it under your raiment. No one will know that you bear a talisman of wild magic." Covenant grasped at the idea. Tugging his ring from his finger, he placed it on the square of Klingor. It stuck firmly. He could not shake the ring loose, but he could peel the Klingor away without difficulty. Nodding sharply to himself, he placed his ring on the leather and opened his shirt and pressed the Klingor to the center of his chest. It held there, gave him no discomfort. Rapidly, as if to seize an opportunity before it passed, he rebuttoned his shirt. To his surprise, he seemed to feel the weight of the ring on his heart, but he resolved to ignore it. Carefully, Foamfollower refolded the Klingor, replaced it within his jerkin. Then he studied Covenant again briefly. Covenant tried to smile in response, express his gratitude, but his face seemed only capable of snarls. At last he turned away, reseated himself in the prow to watch the boat's progress and absorb what Foamfollower had done for him. After musing for a time, he remembered Atiaran's stone knife. It made possible a self-discipline that he sorely needed. He leaned over the side of the boat to wet his face, then took up the knife and painstakingly shaved his whiskers. The beard was 8 days old, but the keen, slick blade slid smoothly over his cheeks and down his neck. And he did a passable job of shaving without cutting himself. But he was out of practice, no longer accustomed to the risk. The prospect of blood made his heart tremble. Then he began to see how urgently he needed to return to his real world, needed to recover himself before he altogether lost his ability to survive as a leper. Later that day came rain, a light drizzle which spattered the surface of the river, whirling the sky mirror into myriad pieces. The drops brushed his face like spray, seeped slowly into his clothes until he was as soaked and uncomfortable as if he had been drenched. But he endured it in a gray, dull reverie, thinking about what he gained and lost by hiding his ring. At last the day ended. Darkness dripped into the air as if the rain were simply becoming blacker, and in the twilight Covenant and Foamfollower ate their supper glumly. The giant was almost too weak to feed himself, but with Covenant's help he managed a decent meal, drank a great quantity of diamond draught. Then they returned to their respective silences. Covenant was glad for the dusk. It spared him the sight of Foamfollower's exhaustion. Unwilling to lie down on the damp floorboards, he huddled cold and wet against the side of the boat and tried to relax, sleep. After a time, Foamfollower began to chant faintly. "Stone and sea are deep in life, two unalterable symbols of the world, permanence at rest and permanence in motion, participants in the power that remains." He seemed to gather strength from the song, and with it he impelled the boat steadily against the current, drove northward as if there were no fatigue that could make him falter. Finally the rain stopped. The cloud cover slowly broke open, but Covenant and Foamfollower found no relief in the clear sky. Over the horizon the red moon stood like a blot, an imputation of evil, on the outraged background of the stars. It turned the surrounding terrain into a dank bloodscape, full of crimson and evanescent forms like uncomprehended murders. And from the light came a putrid emanation as if the land were illumined by a bane. Then Foamfollower's plain song sounded dishearteningly frail, futile, and the stars themselves seemed to shrink away from the moon's course. But dawn brought a sunlight-washed day unriven by any taint or memory of taint. When Covenant raised himself to look around, he saw mountains directly to the north. They spread away westward, where the tallest of them were still snow-crested, but the range ended abruptly at a point in line with the White River. Already the mountains seemed near at hand. 10 leagues, Foamfollower whispered hoarsely. Half a day against this current. The giant's appearance filled Covenant with sharp dismay. Dull-eyed and slack-lipped, Foamfollower looked like a corpse of himself. His beard seemed grayer, as if he had aged several years overnight, and a trail of spittle he was helpless to control ran from the corner of his mouth. The pulse in his temples limped raggedly, but his grip on the tiller was as hard as a gnarled knot of wood, and the boat plowed stiffly up the briskening river. Covenant moved to the stern to try to be of help. He wiped the giant's lips and held up the jug of diamond draught so that Foamfollower could drink. The fragments of a smile cracked the giant's lips, and he breathed, "Stone and sea, it is no easy thing to be your friend. Tell your next ferryman to take you downstream. Destinations are for stronger souls than mine." "Nonsense," said Covenant gruffly. "They're going to make up songs about you for this. Don't you think it's worth it?" Foamfollower tried to respond, but the effort made him cough violently, and he had to retreat into himself, concentrate the fading fire of his spirit on the clench of his fist and the progress of the boat. "That's all right," Covenant said softly. "Everyone who helps me ends up exhausted, one way or another. If I were a poet, I would make up your song myself." Cursing silently at his helplessness, he fed the giant sections of tangerine until there was no fruit left. As he looked at Foamfollower, the tall being, shriven of everything except the power to endure, self-divested, for reasons Covenant could not comprehend, of every quality of humor or even dignity, as if they were mere appurtenances. He felt irrationally in debt to Foamfollower, as if he had been sold, behind his back and with blithe unregard for his consent, into the usury of his only friend. "Everyone who helps me," he muttered again. He found the prices of the people of the land were willing to pay for him appalling. Finally, he was no longer able to stand the sight. He returned to the bow, where he stared at the looming mountains with deserted eyes and grumbled, "I didn't ask for this." "Do I hate myself so much?" he demanded. But his only answer was the rattle of Foamfollower's breathing. Half the morning passed that way, measured in butchered hunks out of the impenetrable circumstance of time by the rasp of Foamfollower's respiration. Around the boat the terrain stiffened as if preparing itself for a leap into the sky. The hills grew higher and more ragged, gradually leaving behind the heather and banyan trees of the plains for a stiffer scrub grass that a few scattered cedars. And ahead the mountains stood taller beyond the hills with every curve of the river. Now Covenant could see the east end of the range dropped steeply to a plateau like a stair into the mountains, a plateau perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 feet high that ended in a straight cliff to some effect of the light, in a straight cliff to the foothills. From the plateau came a waterfall, and some effect of the light on the rock made the cascade gleam pale blue as it tumbled. "Furrow Falls," Covenant said to himself. In spite of the rattle of Foamfollower's breathing, he felt a stirring in his heart, as if he were drawing near to something grand. but the drawing near lost its swiftness steadily, as the white wound between the hills as the white wound between the hills, it narrowed, and as a result, the current grew increasingly stiff. The giant seemed to have passed the end of his endurance. His respiration sounded stertorous enough to strangle him at any time. He moved the boat hardly faster than a walk. Covenant did not see how they could cover the last leagues. He studied the riverbanks for a place to land the boat. He intended somehow to make the giant take the boat to shore. But while he was still looking, he heard a low rumble in the air, like the running of horses. What the hell? A vision of Erviles filled in his mind. He snatched up his staff from the bottom of the boat and clenched it, trying to control the sudden drum of his trepidation. The next moment, like a breaking wave over the crest of a hill upstream and east from the boat, came cantering a score of horses bearing riders. The riders were human, men and women. The instant they saw the boat, one of them shouted, and the group broke into a gallop, sweeping down the hill to rein in at the edge of the river. The riders looked like warriors. They wore high, soft-soled boots over black leggings, black sleeveless shirts covered by breastplates molded of a yellow metal, and yellow headbands. A short sword hung from each belt, a bow and quiver of arrows from each back. Scanning them rapidly, Covenant saw the characteristic features of both Woodhelvinen and Stonedowner. Some were tall and fair, light eyes and slim, and others square, dark, and muscular. As soon as their horses were stopped, the riders slammed their right fists in unison to their hearts, then extended their arms, palms forward, in the gesture of welcome. A man distinguished by a black diagonal line across his breastplate shouted over the water, "Hail, Rock Brother! Welcome and honor and fealty to you and to your people. I am Quan, Warhaft of the 3rd Eomen, of the war ward of Lord's Keep." He paused for a reply, and when Covenant said nothing, he went on in a more cautious tone. "Lord Moram sent us. He saw that important matters were moving on the river today. We are come as escort." Covenant looked at Foamfollower, but what he saw only convinced him that the giant was past knowing what happened around him. He slumped in the stern, deaf and blind to everything except his failing effort to drive the boat. Covenant turned back toward the yeoman and called out, "Help us, he's dying." Quan stiffened, then sprang into action. He snapped an order, and the next instant he and 2 other riders plunged their horses into the river. The 2 others headed directly for the west bank, but Quan guided his horse to intercept the boat. The Mustang swam powerfully as if such work were part of its training. Quan soon neared the boat. At the last moment he stood up on his mount's back and vaulted easily over the gunwales. On command, his horse started back toward the east bank. Momentarily, Quan measured Covenant with his eyes, and Covenant saw in his thick black hair, broad shoulders, and transparent face that he was a Stonedowner. Then the Warhaft moved toward Foamfollower. He gripped the giant's shoulders and shook them, barking words which Covenant could not understand. At first, Foamfollower did not respond. He sat sightless, transfixed, with his hand clamped like a death grip onto the tiller. But slowly Quan's voice seemed to penetrate him. The cords of his neck trembled as he lifted his head, tortuously brought his eyes into focus on Quan. Then, with a groan that seemed to spring from the very marrow of his bones, he released the tiller and fell over sideways. The craft immediately lost headway, began drifting back downriver. But by this time the 2 other riders were already on the west bank. Quan stepped past Covenant into the bow of the boat, and when he was in position, one of the 2 riders threw the end of a long line to him. He caught it neatly and looped it over the prow. It stuck where he put it. It was not rope, but clingor. At once he turned toward the east bank. Another line reached him, and he attached it also to the prow. The lines pulled taut. The boat stopped drifting. Then Quan waved his arm, and the riders began moving along the banks, pulling the boat upstream. As soon as he understood what was being done, Covenant turned back to Foamfollower. The giant lay where he had fallen, and his breathing was shallow, irregular. Covenant groped momentarily for some way to help, and then lifted the leather jug and poured a quantity of diamond draught over Foamfollower's head. The liquid ran into his mouth. He sputtered at it, swallowed heavily. Then he took a deep, rattling breath, and his eyes slitted open. Covenant held the jug to his lips, and after drinking from it, he reached out flat in the bottom of the boat. At once he fell into a deep sleep. In relief, Covenant murmured over him, "Now that's a fine way to end a song." And then he went to sleep. What good is being a hero if you don't stay awake until you get congratulated? He felt suddenly tired, as if the giant's exhaustion had drained his own strength, and sighing, he sat down on one of the thwarts to watch their progress up the river, while Quan went to the stern to take the tiller. For a while Covenant ignored Quan's scrutiny, but finally he gathered enough energy to say, "He's Saltheart Foamfollower, a legate from the sea-reach giants. He hasn't rested since he picked me up in the center of Andalane 3 days ago." He saw comprehension on Foamfollower's plight spread across Quan's face. Then he turned his attention to the passing terrain. The towing horses kept up a good pace against the white's tightening current. Their riders deftly managed the variations of the riverbanks, trading haulers and slackening one rope or another whenever necessary. As they moved north, the soil became rockier and the scrub grass gave way to bracken. Gildan trees spread their broad boughs and leaves more and more thickly over the foothills, and the sunlight made the gold foliage glow warmly. Ahead, the plateau now appeared nearly a league wide, and on its west the mountains stood erect as if they were upright in pride. By noon, Covenant could hear the roar of the great falls, and he guessed that they were close to Revelstone, though the high foothills now blocked most of his view. The roaring approached steadily. Soon the boat passed under a wide bridge, and a short time later the riders rounded the last curve, drew the boat into a lake at the foot of Furrow Falls. The lake was round and rough in shape, wide, edged along its whole western side by Gildan and pine. It stood at the base of the cliff, more than 2,000 feet of sheer precipice, and the blue water came thundering down into it from the plateau like the loud heart's blood of the mountains. In the lake, the water was as clean and cool as rain-washed ether, and Covenant could see clearly the depths of its bouldered bottom. Knotted jacarandas and delicate blue flowers clustered on the wet rocks at the base of the falls, but most of the lake's eastern shore was clear of trees. There stood 2 large piers and several smaller loading docks. At one pier rested a boat much like the one Covenant rode in, and smaller craft, skiffs and rafts, were tied to the docks. Under Quan's guidance, the riders pulled the boat up to one of the piers, where 2 of the yeomen made it fast. And then the war-haft gently awakened Foamfollower. The giant came out of his sleep with difficulty, but when he pried his eyes open they were calm, unhaggard, though he looked as weak as if his bones were made of sandstone. With help from Quan and Covenant, he climbed into a sitting position. There he rested, looking dazedly about him as if he wondered where his strength had gone. After a time he said thinly to Quan, "Your pardon, war-haft. I am a little tired." "I see you," Quan murmured. "Do not be concerned. Revelstone is near." For a moment Foamfollower frowned in perplexity as he tried to remember what had happened to him. Then a look of recollection tensed his face. "Send riders," he breathed urgently. "Gather the lords. There must be a council." Quan smiled. "Times change, rock brother. The newest lord, Moram, son of Variol, is a seer and oracle. 10 days ago he sent riders to the Lorstrat and to High Lord Prothal in the north. All will be at the keep tonight. That is well, the giant sighed. These are shadowed times. Terrible purposes are abroad. So we have seen, responded Quan grimly. But Saltheart Foamfollower has hastened enough. I will send the fame of your brave journey ahead to the keep. They will provide a litter to bear you if you desire it. Foamfollower shook his head, and Quan vaulted up to the pier to give orders to one of his yeomen. The giant looked at Covenant and smiled faintly. "Stone and sea, my friend," he said. "Did I not say that I would bring you here swiftly?" That smile touched Covenant's heart like a clasp of affection. Thickly he replied, "Next time take it easier. I can't stand watching. Do you always keep promises this way?" "Your messages are urgent. How could I do otherwise?" From his leper's perspective, Covenant countered, "Nothing's that urgent. What good does anything do if you kill yourself in the process?" For a moment, Foamfollower did not respond. He braced a heavy hand on Covenant's shoulders and heaved himself, tottering, to his feet. Then he said, as if he were answering Covenant's question, "Come, we must see Revelstone." Willing hands helped him onto the pier, and shortly he was standing on the shore of the lake. Despite the toll of his exertion, he dwarfed even the men and women on horseback. And as Covenant joined him, he introduced his passenger with a gesture like an according of dominion. "Yeoman of the War Ward, this is my friend Thomas Covenant, unbeliever and message-bearer to the Council of Lords. He partakes of many strange knowledges, but he does not know the land. Ward him well, for the sake of friendship, and for the semblance which he bears of Beric Heartthew, earth-friend and Lord-Fatherer." In response, Quan gave Covenant the salute of welcome. "I offer you the greetings of Lord's Keep, giant wrought Revelstone," he said. "Be welcome in the land, welcome and true." Covenant returned the gesture brusquely, but did not speak, and a moment later Foamfollower said to Quan, "Let us go. My eyes are hungry to behold the great work of my forebearers." The Warhalf nodded, spoke to his command. At once 2 riders galloped away to the east, and 2 more took positions on either side of the giant so that he could support himself on the back.